Today feels like a particular all-star lineup in the context of high performance. First up, we've got Shola Kaye, who is an absolute rock star in the field of introversion and performance. So the fact is that we are working with lots of different people in Travel Park, many of whom would consider themselves introverts. And today's about supporting them with tactics and tools to help them continue their high performance and within the context of their introversion.
My name's Shola Kaye and I work as a keynote speaker and a trainer. And the work that I do lies at the intersections of inclusion, emotional intelligence and communication. So I'm here in Barcelona this week to speak to a group of high-performing individuals about introversion and some of the assumptions that get made about introverts and how introverts can really succeed in the workplace and what workplaces need to do to make their environments more conducive to introvert success. I just felt that it's a big topic, especially in this world where we're kind of really trying to welcome more diversity. It's one of the areas that I think isn't spoken about that much, even though at least 30% of the population tend to be introverts or have some introverted aspects to their behaviour. And I'm also really excited if there's any introverts in the audience who maybe this will help them, and even extroverts as well who they might think differently about introverts afterwards. So yeah, I'm really, really psyched for today.
Shola, I just want to get stuck into it right away because you have so much wisdom that we're going to be covering today. Let's talk about the context of introversion within the context of high performance. How does it all fit together and why is this important to you?
First of all, I'd love to know, how many of you are introverts here? Put your hand up. Or even ambiverts. Higher, please. Okay, quite a lot. So I'd probably say, was that 60%, would you say, Tony?
I'd say so.
Yeah, a good number. So there are still, and we'll delve into this a little bit later, but there's a lot of assumptions about introverts, what introverts are, what sort of affliction introversion might be, and I think that gets in the way. I mean, especially if we're talking about 30-40% of the population. So for me, it's a subject that's really close to my heart, and it's always interested me, but I recently sent a newsletter out to a lot of the people that follow me, and I said, well, what are some of the issues that you face as an introvert? And some people were really angry and they just felt they hadn't been getting a look in, So as a result of that, I started to put together some content around introversion. And so we'll go into some of that today.
This sounds like a column for very upset people. Introverts who are like, Shola, help me. I think you should have a newspaper column, but instead we get to share it here. So I'm excited. I think what's really interesting about introversion and extroversion is often the definitions are misunderstood, right? And we're going to get into how they're conflated with other aspects of identity and character and behaviors. But how would you define introversion?
For me, it's really around energy, where you get your energy from. So some people will get their energy from being by themselves or doing solitary activities, and other people get really energized by being around other people. And that's the definition that I tend to go with.
Yeah, I like that. I think it is often misunderstood. So I'm glad that we've had time to clarify that's where you get your energy. We're going to talk about some of the conflicts. So let's get into that actually right now. Because I think the challenge with labeling people in general of like, you're an introvert, you're an extrovert, because I'm sure there are folks here that think I actually can go either way. I know for me, especially, and I'm sure it's especially relevant for our high performers when they are, really deep in their performance and they're focused. I'm sure sometimes they're like, lock me away after, don't talk to me. I want to make sure before we go on, because we've talked a little bit about definition of it. You've talked about your context of the newsletter and content. Anything else in terms of setting the table, Shola, before we move to your first point about introversion within the context of high performance? Is there anything that came out as a number one trend, maybe, of like the different things you've heard?
Some people felt that as a high performer, and they regarded themselves as a high performer, they felt that there was a certain way that one must behave. And if you don't behave that way as an introvert, then you don't get opportunities. So, for example, maybe when you're interacting in a meeting, you've got to interact in a certain way. And if you don't, then you don't have the potential to really make it. Or if you're a quieter communicator, that means that you can't be a decent leader. So those are some of the things that people really got upset about.
Shola, for me, that's the perfect jumping off point into your first point, which is don't assume all introverts are the same. So let's hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was something that really came up as well when I did this poll, this survey, and people said, "Well, I'm an introvert, but I'm very outgoing," or "I'm an introvert and I enjoy public speaking or running presentations and things." And there's a lot of layers that can come with introversion. And I'll just share with you, there's a model called the STAR model, STAR. And this is on the 4 different kinds of introverts. So there's one kind, which is what we call the social introvert. And these are people who don't really enjoy being around groups of people. They just like socializing, maybe one-on-one or, a couple of people. Then you've got the T, which is for thinking. So thinking introverts, people who spend a lot of time maybe mulling over things, in their heads. Then you've got A, which is for anxious introverts. And this is more like people who might be shy or have social anxiety. They're worried about being judged when they're around people. So that kind of affects the way that they behave. And then you've got R, and R has just popped out of my head, but it'll come back. But I was talking, my brother and his wife are both massive extroverts. And I hadn't spoken to my sister-in-law for probably a couple of years. And so she got on the phone and she said, she was talking, we've done this and we've been here, blah, blah, blah. And Shola, how are you? And I'm thinking, I've done a few things. What am I going to tell her? Then by the time I opened my mouth to speak, anyway, right? So she just carried on. So I think one huge thing that we can do for introverts is just to give people a moment to, to get involved in the conversation. Anyone here like drum and bass? Okay, one person. So to my mind, like it's almost like there's 2 different dances going on. So when extroverts communicate with each other, maybe they're dancing at kind of drum and bass tempo, right? And then when introverts are communicating, maybe it's more like a ballad tempo, right? So a lot of introverts find it really hard when 2 extroverts are really going at it in conversation. How do I get a word in? Right, and the moment never comes. So I think that could be quite a nice model to think about. Maybe I need to just slow down the beats per minute for a second, let the introvert speak, and just have a pace that's more comfortable for everybody.
I love that. I love that we're already thinking about how we can understand it. And I love music. But Shola, I like that we're getting into, well, what can we do and the sort of imagery around music. Let's go back to the key point around assumptions, because you and I were just chatting beforehand around some of the assumptions people make when it comes to introverts. Tell us a little bit about your thinking around that.
Yeah, so the assumptions can work on a few different levels. So I spent a few years working as a professional singer, and people tend to, when they hear that, they say, yeah, but how can you be an introvert and a singer? Or I do a lot of speaking. How can you be an introvert and do speaking? And just because someone's an introvert doesn't mean to say that they don't enjoy being in front of other people. Or maybe they don't particularly need loads of eyeballs on them, but they enjoy sharing information one to many because it's quite efficient. If you think about that energy saving aspect, you need to be alone to get energy. So if you're communicating one to many, that's a really handy and quick way to get things across rather than loads of one-to-one conversations. So that's one level of assumptions that can happen. And then you've got the assumptions that kind of align, if you like, with intersectionality. And I was speaking to somebody a while ago. He runs something called Black Introvert Week in the States and in the UK. And he ended up he worked in internal communication for the UK government. And he had quite a senior role. And he said that when people see him as an introvert, they say, oh, you're so easygoing, you're so relaxed, you're so laid back. And in some circumstances, being called relaxed and laid back might stop you from being promoted, right? Mm-hmm. So there was that layer of seeing a Black guy who is maybe fairly quiet. Oh, he must be so easygoing that he's not particularly on the ball. So there are assumptions there. Or sometimes if somebody's quiet, they can be labeled as being quietly aggressive, right? Or why didn't you come to the pub with us after work? You must be judgmental, or you must, and maybe the person just needs to go home to relax. So I think we've got to be quite careful around the assumptions that we make around people, and maybe just ask them. Or another thing that can really work well is if you're, and you probably are doing this already, but maybe personality profiling or anything like that, because then that naturally lends itself to a conversation around, how come you behave that way, or people kind of a little bit more forgiving in terms of the behavior that they see.
Yeah, that story that you had told us around the labeling, the intersectionality is really interesting, right? And I want to, you mentioned the psychometrics. It's something we use as a tool. I'm not the person that says this is the be all and end all. If you've ever done Insights or True Colors or MBTI, it's not like build your house on it, but it's interesting, right? My fear with those things, and I think you're basically alluding to this as well, or actually clearly calling it out, is when we start to label people. We start to say, well, introvert. Oh, it must, of course, they're always never coming to the bar. That doesn't make any sense. They're never coming to the bar. They're never hanging out. They're introvert and so on. How can we, Shola, better sort of call out those assumptions or sort of mitigate against them, really, when you're working together with people? And I know we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about that, but just in general, how do we get over these assumptions in the workplace?
Yeah, I think it's very much around communication. I think it's around another tool, actually, before I go on, is the personal user manual. I don't know if you ever use those here. So personal user manual is just a document that everybody writes about themselves, saying, this is my best way of working. This is how I like to receive feedback. So even modifying those sorts of questions on a personal user manual document, or if it's not used as a company-wide tool, it might be used as a team, right? Or if you're a manager, or you just say to your colleagues, hey, I think it'd be really cool to just gather this information about ourselves. So anything like that just really gets people to explore the different personalities, preferences, preferred ways of working, etc., can be really, really powerful in just getting people talking.
Yeah, I love that. I once worked with a leader, and I asked him, I said, how do you know what your team are motivated by? And he looked at me and he said, I just know. And I went, in what world? We're so bad at reading people. We're so bad at mislabeling people or trying to label people and put them in a box. And so what I love about these user guides, which I subscribe to, is it reflects the diversity of the team and their preferences, way of thinking, doing, acting, communicating. So I love that. But let's get back to introverts, because I want to help our introverts in the room, of which there are 60% and perhaps more logging in online. Your point number 2, Shola, is what can high-performing introverts do to achieve more? So let's talk about what we can do to help our introverts be better, have more success in the workplace.
So I think, especially if you've had the conversation around your being an introvert, or understanding what your preferences are in your team members as well, I think there's a lot of things that go on in meetings or in companies. So, example, meetings, brainstorming, those sorts of things, which are not naturally the best environments for introverts, right? So you might be in a meeting where ideas are being kind of flung around really quickly, and you feel like you don't have an opportunity to contribute, for example. So some of it is around slowing things down, or, for example, saying to a manager, could you get me the agenda beforehand so I can have a think about what my contribution is going to be? Or even if a decision is made in a meeting, maybe ahead of time you say, well, it would be quite nice if we could just reflect on this decision for a little bit longer, so I can just maybe email you with a few ideas, or reflect on the decisions that's been made, and then we'll come back and look at it again, so that you have that time to really kind of delve deeply. So anything like that can be really helpful. Even things like in meetings, allowing people to write down what their ideas are, rather than everything being verbal. So you could have everybody write down their ideas, submit them to one person who then reads them out. So anything like that can really help, because quite often we've got this idea that the most charismatic or loudest voice is the most correct person, and it's not the case.
You could say it's nonsense, because it is nonsense.
Yeah. I was going to swear, but I won't.
You are live on the BBC. So it's interesting, and perhaps this is resonate with some of you, where you've come out of a meeting and you felt like you didn't have a chance to share your voice, your opinion, because it moves so fast. The first experience I had with that was in my first career in the nonprofit world, doing sort of community relations work across division back in my hometown. And we had this meeting. It was highly energized and driven. And the person in the room that I knew was the smartest didn't say a word until we left the meeting and we started walking to lunch. And then she said something to me. We'd all agreed, by the way, decisions had been made. And she said something to me, and I looked at her. I was like, why didn't you tell us in the meeting? And she just needed that extra time. And it's really interesting, because from that moment, I've seen myself both in my personal life, in terms of conversations with friends even, and definitely in the workplace, of trying to be someone that enables introverts to perform highly, right? To be able to help them create space and probably put into place some of the things you're talking about, Shola. So we've talked a little bit about techniques around sort of things within meetings and brainstorms. What role does energy play in this, right? Because oftentimes when I'm working with introverts, and I see it, after especially full day conferences, many of which I know you're a part of, like, how do you manage your energy in a busy day? Because we're sitting in front of high performers that I suspect are very busy all the time, back to back in meetings, constant. What's your advice in terms of the energy piece?
I think you've got to schedule in some time for you to have a couple of moments to have a breather, to catch up. Or it might be, if you are let's say that you're doing a lot of meetings over a period of time, maybe those are not the evenings where you're going to go out and, kind of dance on the tables or anything, right? You're going to go home instead and relax. So it's really about, as far as you can, if you can kind of predict what your energy output is going to be, then you can schedule the time for you to replenish that. I think also alongside that is to not beat yourself up that you need that time. Because I know, my world is events, and yet I still come away from events thinking, oh, if only I could have had one more conversation, or if only, I had more energy to kind of stay a bit longer. And it's not productive. You've just got to think about, how do I function, perform at my best? Yeah. And if you need the energy, you need it, basically. So
I love the tip of, or the comment that you made there, Shola, about replenishing. And it's certainly something that I'm aware of now. The more work we do, the more I go, oh, there's my calendar, back to back to back. There's not even enough time to go to the loo, let alone replenish. And it's something I've tried to do, is create space in the calendar by blocking off time, DNS, do not schedule, don't bother me. I think that really works for me. I'm curious, because I suspect some of the folks here, high performers, working in teams, working under leaders, and they're sitting here going, yeah, that's all well and good, Shola, for you and Tony. You get to travel and be your own boss, but I have a manager and I have a team that I have to be responsive to and responsible for. How do individuals take ownership as introverts to help have those conversations, to tell people and educate them on what they need to perform at a high level?
I think it's the communication part is enormous. I think that if you are feeling frustrated or unable to do your best, or you're feeling that team members don't have that time, I think the very first thing is to actually find opportunities to communicate with people on that. And there's a lot of studies that say, even giving people some moments one-to-one to speak with you are super important. So it might be allowing people to share anonymously what's going on for them, maybe with a simple Google form. It could be just carving out some time to speak one-to-one if you're a team leader, for example, or asking a manager, I'd love to just chat with you briefly to talk about this. Because I know that very early in my career, I was somebody that would not speak up in meetings at all. I was always feeling really intimidated. And there was an assumption that was made that I just either was lazy or just couldn't do the job. So I ended up being put on probation in my very first role. And, it's quite a scary time, as you can imagine. And a colleague was very empathetic and helped me kind of I don't even know what she did, but we'd meet maybe half an hour before work, and it just gave me a lot more confidence. So even things like talking to people who you feel like they could make more of a contribution, just a simple conversation that, hey, how can we support you? We'd love to hear more from you. What can we do to facilitate that? Anything like that can be really powerful, whether it's on a peer level or, manager kind of team member level, can be really, really useful.
I love that support from your peers and asking the questions and creating space and understanding. We talked last week in this series about sort of root cause of like, you not showing up and whatever led to probation. So you were misinterpreted, right? Your introversion was misinterpreted. And I think that's the challenge, isn't it? Sometimes for us to be quite bold and step forward and say, this is what I need to perform. And for me, anytime we talk about high performance, and those of you that are struggling to have these direct conversations, I think if you take a step back and you empathize with the person, whether it's your manager or your team, it gives me confidence. And I know you did a lot of work in the empathy space, Shola, but it gives me confidence to say, the reason I'm telling you that I need X is because I know we want to achieve Y. And if I don't look after myself, I can't perform at the highest level I can. It sounds like you've obviously mastered that. In fact, fun story about Shola, whenever I asked her about this, about doing the podcast, she was pretty clear with me straight away. We didn't know each other. And you did say, I'm much more comfortable doing a keynote. And I was like, what? How is that the same? But, how is that more difficult for you? Whereas that would be quite challenging for me. Whereas I love that you kind of know yourself, know what gives you energy, and you're able to articulate that. Any other sort of advice you would give to folks that are maybe struggling to kind of say what they need?
Yeah, I mean, I think speaking to what you just said, self-awareness is huge. The more we know ourselves, the better, because then we can convey what we need to others. So, going back to my struggles, if I'd had the sense, like the self-awareness at the time, I could have gone to my manager and said, well, look, you know what, these are the conditions that would really help me to make my maximum contribution. So, and also, I mean, as an introvert, just knowing what, and all of us, right, knowing what the strengths are of ourselves and also our colleagues. So you might have somebody who's really great at doing the analysis or the deep thinking, or they might make amazing, even meeting notes that, have some add-ins that really help people. So just helping people to kind of, first of all, recognizing what people's strengths are, and then celebrating those and helping people to kind of dig in further to benefit the team and the organization.
Yeah, and that's it. It's the benefit to the team and organization. And ultimately, it's funny, I'm sitting here thinking, Shola, we're really pushing our introverts to take ownership and responsibility. We're talking about, but of course, the reality is, as we know, we've all got to be flexible. We've all got to find times to flex, and there's a balance to that, isn't there? So your third point, Shola, we've talked, and we've just to recap, we've talked about assumptions and the intersectionality of assuming certain things about certain people. And so we want to watch out for that. The second thing we looked at just now was around things like energy management, telling people communication, the importance of that, and, setting boundaries through even calendar blocks, for example. And now we're going to move into those in leadership positions and how they can get the best from those who are introverted in their team.
So, first of all, if you are an introvert aspiring to be a leader, one thing that you can do is make sure that you walk around more, you make more contact with people. You might feel that you're more comfortable kind of being behind the scenes, but managing by walking around is one thing they call it, right? Just kind of really letting people know that you're out there and you care for them. But in terms of leaders of introverts, some of the things that you can do are, first of all, speaking to people one-to-one, right? So that's really helpful. Speaking to people in small groups as well, rather than in front of the entire room. Then being a more inclusive leader is a huge one. So there are a lot of different things that you can do in terms of inclusive leadership. Anyone here ever experienced a meeting where there's one or two people that dominate the meeting? Everyone's like, yeah, I've been there.
Yeah, I'm raising my hand thinking, I try not to.
It's you, isn't it? You're the one. Yeah. So one thing, or some of the many things that we can do to stop that from happening are, you could have a clock, right? So you've got the timer on, and you say everyone's got 2 minutes or 1 minute to share. Or you might say, let's say Tony is about to speak, and you might say, Tony, I want you to look at Felicia. She's coming next. She too has got something to say. So please be brief, right? That can work really well. Going round one by one to people and telling people, not only who's coming next, but, we spoke last week, didn't we, about this topic? I know you've got some brilliant ideas. So encouraging people to share, all those things work really well. Even things like having somebody who is what we call a neutral observer. So if you see that there's some bias that's taking place in the room or somebody who's dominating, that neutral observer has got like a red button to go, boom, stop the meeting. I think we should reset because X, Y, and Z. So those are some of the things that we can do to run more inclusive meetings. Even things like ideas. If let's say that as a leader, you love to share your ideas. So you might say, I've got this idea, we should do this thing, but I want everyone to tell me one reason why it will work and one reason why it won't. And that can be really empowering because quite often anyone who, sometimes people are afraid to share because they can seen as being a sort of downer or the risk averse sort of person. But anything like that can really help people, free them up to speak because you're being asked to speak in both, for and against. So those are some, quite basic things around being an inclusive leader. And if a quick story, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was, and you might get pushback on this, right? Especially from those people that love to speak. And I was facilitating a session on empathy at a business school. And for me, it's really, especially as somebody who's an introvert, it's really important to hear from as many different voices as possible. Because I've been in those meetings where you've got a facilitator and there's one person that puts their hand up all the time. And it's almost like the facilitator and that person are just having their own direct conversation and everyone else is just sitting. So I'm running this meeting and I'm asking, people to answer questions. And there's this one guy in the second row and he's that person that just puts his hand up for every question. So I took 2 answers from him. And then when he put his hand up the third time, I said, look, I'm really sorry, but there's 80 people in this room. I'd love to hear from more people. So after that, instead of him sitting up, he was like slumped on the desk, right? Because he was kind of no longer engaged. So then at the end of and people putting their hand up and different voices were chiming in. And then at the end of the meeting, I said, oh, anyone, if you got any comments, come up and see me. So this guy was like the first in line. And he said, I can't believe that you told me not to put my hand up anymore. That's outrageous. And I said, yeah, but there's 80 people. I need to hear from everybody. He said, yes, but I think you're biased. You're discriminating against me. And I'm nearly crying like, me? How can you say I discriminated? Right? But, and then other people came up later and said, no, it worked well because new voices were speaking that we hadn't heard from. But the point of the story is that you may get pushback if you try and become a more inclusive leader. But I think it's worth it.
Oh my goodness. That poor extrovert who couldn't be engaged if he wasn't hearing his own voice. That's not me, to be clear. I think it's so important, right? And I love some of the things around creating the space one by one. I haven't heard from so-and-so. I like the idea and you mentioned this already, Shola, particularly working with introverts, to give them an agenda ahead of time so they can reflect those thinkers, especially that want to come prepared rather than spring something on them and expect them to have a quick answer and so on. I actually had, in this space of learning and development, I've had a couple of experiences that have been really useful in helping me facilitate and get the best out of introverts. One is online learning. What I have found really useful with the online space is it democratizes input because everyone has access to the chat function. So I can really gather and crowdsource lots of input. Plus everyone's and you get to mute them if you want. You can just mute people. So I find that really great. But I also had this experience with in a graduate program that we run in Ireland. And I had this one guy, he was super engaged because oftentimes, like this person you told us, he was just really engaged. He was totally locked in and interested in what you had to say. I know because I would sometimes be that person. I've had to develop and grow and change my tack. But at this one guy I was working with in this graduate program, and he was so focused on contributing each time. And I probably made light of it as well. Like, oh, James, oh gosh, I've just named him. James, if you're listening, I'm sorry about this. But James is going. I said, James, that's great. Thanks so much. And then I would use three names and I would say, I haven't heard from Marta, Paola, Donna, any of you want to share in a workshop setting? And I remember afterwards he came up to me and I thought I was going to have the experience you had. But instead, what he shared with me was just, thank you for calling me out on that. I'm aware that sometimes I over contribute and it can be a bit disruptive. And I thought, oh my goodness, what a legend for being so self-aware. And I think sometimes those of us that are on the other extroverts side, we're so engaged that we forget to create space for others. And I think that's something we really have to do, don't we?
I love that story. That's brilliant. There's a very self-aware individual there.
I'm taking a lot from this, and just it's a reminder to create conditions for introverts to give their best and to perform at a high level. If we were to adopt all the different things that you've shared today, Shola, how might the world change for the better?
Well, I think that we obviously want to hear from as many different individuals as possible, right? Because it's good for innovation. It's the right thing to do. We're all here. We all have worth as human beings. So I just feel that the better able we are to be aware of these things, the more we can empower not only introverts, but every voice. So yeah, I think that's the outcome we're all looking for.
I love that. I thought you were going to break into song there. Folks, let's give a round of applause. Big thank you to Shola Kaye.